few more people here now, so we will go ahead and get started. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon for our chat with Linda and Nik about AI policy and governance. Linda Clark is our wonderful academic director of the online data science program. She has been instrumental in hiring all of our faculty members and helping develop the courses. And she also teaches the first technical course in the program. And then we have Nik Marda here, who is teaching and developing two courses in our program. He previously worked on tech policy in the Biden White House and has also worked as a technical lead for AI governance at Mozilla. So we're really excited to have him as part of our program. So I will pass it over to Linda now, who's going to moderate the discussion.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited that Nik has taken time out of his really, really busy schedule to spend a few moments with us and chat. Nik, I thought maybe we could just get started. Maybe you could say a little bit about yourself, what your background was, and maybe how you got to our program. Think we need to unmute. There we go.
Yeah. Well, Linda and Amanda, thanks for having me, and folks, thanks for joining. So my background is, I think Amanda summarized it well. I'll give a little more color to that. Um, my background is both technical and policy. For example, I did a master's in computer science at one point, and I found myself at the intersection of those two fields for a while. First, from more of the civic tech side. So that's the set of work that's focused on getting more technical folks into government and into nonprofits and trying to help build the tools that allow us to deliver public services and programs to people. And so I worked on that for a couple of years. But that world also intersects pretty deeply with the group of people who are thinking about how to use government as a force to help steer and regulate technology. And so I found myself pulled more and more into that side of things. And I ended up at the Biden White House working on primarily AI governance. So trying to figure out how to use the tools of policy, the levers of the White House and the government to help shape the development of AI across society in a direction that made it more fair, more just, more safe, and more beneficial. And so I worked primarily on the side of thinking about regulations, governance, procurement, etc., to try to help make it safer and more fair. While I was there, I helped lead some of the work on AI bias and civil rights and equity. Um, I worked with some other folks you all might know, Suresh, who is who's on the faculty here, and I worked together very closely on things like the AI Bill of Rights, which was a document that we produced at the White House to try to articulate what it means to develop AI in a way that preserves our fundamental rights, opportunities, and access to critical services. So it's a very civil rights oriented document to say essentially like, hey, these technologies exist in a world where bias and discrimination are very present. What do we do about that, and how do we make these tools um, not necessarily continue to perpetuate those biases, but actually help fight them? And so I was there during the time period too where ChatGPT became a big sensation and we started seeing generative AI sort of really dominate the AI conversation. And so during that time period, I was actually leading the US government's work on developing an AI strategy. And so was there in those early phases where we were figuring out, how much we were going to be concerned about some of these safety concerns there, what we were going to do about them, how we were going to work with industry or push back. Um, and I was there till the end of 2023, at which point the president had signed an executive order on AI that I helped write. And then I left the White House and went to Mozilla for a year and a half, where I worked largely on open source and transparency around AI. So essentially, trying to make sure that these powerful systems that a few companies are building aren't just fully within their control, but rather things that everyone can sort of have a meaningful say in and part in helping shape. And today I am managing a congressional campaign in southern Minnesota, which maybe feels like a little bit of a 180. Um, but and I can get into that in a bit, but I do feel like a lot of the fights around AI policy are now just becoming fights about policy and politics. So I don't think it's actually a huge shift to move in more of that direction if you care about shaping the impacts of AI. So Amanda mentioned I'm also teaching two classes here, and happy to talk about those two, but one's on AI bias and fairness, and the other is on what we're dubbing advanced topics in AI governance. It's essentially a series of case studies about the different ways AI governance actually manifests in real life in this day and age.
Yeah, I love the fact that your career path has really almost coalesced with these developments, starting off as a straight up sort of CS, more technically oriented person. And it really, I think, uh, role models what folks who are interested in thinking about these issues can do if they're interested and if they start to pursue these opportunities.
Yeah.
I also feel like Brown is very fortunate to have now both you and Suresh back under the same roof, so to speak. And so we certainly appreciate all that you're doing for us, Nik.
Well, I'm glad to be here, and I think that Brown as an institution is just like the sort of emphasis on interdisciplinary work and creativity and the sort of culture here is something I think is right for this type of work. Um, I think AI governance is like inherently very interdisciplinary, and I think it's really important to not just view it as a technical subject or a legal subject, and I can get into that too, but like I think people think that AI policy and AI law are just sort of policy, law, and tech, and it's just not true at all. And I think the way that this program is set up, and I think more broadly how Brown thinks about things as a sort of university culture, I'm just really grateful to be a part of that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I would add on top of that that data science fundamentally, which we would say is a big piece of AI or encompasses AI, depending on how you look at it, is also interdisciplinary in and of itself. So we have a lot of sort of ingredients going into this pot to be able to really think through these issues. So I think this is really, really important and timely work too. So what we're going to do is I've got a series of prompts for Nik that I'm going to sort of pose to Nik, and we'll go through sort of a question and answer format between Nik and I. As questions come up, please put them in the Q&A or the chat. We have Amanda will be monitoring that, and she can also prompt us, but we'll circle around to those questions at the end. And again, Nik's already offered up. He can speak on a lot of different things. So if there's something that you'd like to hear more about, please put that in the chat as well. So I'll start with sort of our first question for you, Nik, is uh, how has the work that you did in the Biden White House persisted beyond the Biden White House, or did it all get wiped out with the changing of the administration?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, I think certainly a lot of things changed when the administration's changed, and I'll just try to paint a little bit of a bigger picture because I don't know where everyone is at in this room in terms of how closely everyone follows U.S. federal policy development on AI. Um, so the Biden administration on AI, we took an emphasis on um, mitigating bias and promoting equity in the development of AI systems, right? So we had a number of policies that explicitly said like, hey, don't use AI in ways that might be biased. And like, here's how to stop doing that. Here's some guidance on how to prevent that. And it was all like, I think, and I'm biased, of course, but I think it was all sensible policy of like, hey, we're not generally saying like you can't use AI. In fact, we're going to encourage it in a lot of places. What we're saying is like, let's take a risk-based approach that says, in these particular use cases, we think that the risk of bias is high enough. So we're going to introduce these mechanisms to essentially check for bias and mitigate it. Um, and so that was an all of government approach. We were trying to do that across the board. And one of the policies I worked on the most, and it's the one of the things I'm proudest of, was guidance on how the federal government itself uses AI. So we wrote this policy that the White House issued to federal agencies saying, hey, here's how to use your AI systems responsibly so that, among other things, they aren't biased. And we issued this guidance. We spent a year implementing it. The incoming administration comes in, and they, of course, repeal sort of the high level policy framing, that where we said like, hey, bias is bad, right? Like they got rid of that. And I guess that means bias is good now, but sure. Um, but what they didn't do is they didn't fully gut the actual specific requirements on federal agencies. They edited them and they made them softer in a number of places, but the final text that they held up, like the current guidance for federal agencies on how to use AI, is not that far off from what we wrote. And so it's a fascinating example of like, there's all this political rhetoric of like, saying the last administration was woke and whatnot. But in the actual policy edits that were made on this specific document, which is one of the most important pieces of policy we worked on, it's still generally continuing the work of making sure these systems are fair and responsible. And so that is good. Where I think it is particularly bad, though, is that we really prioritized in the last administration the implementation of this guidance, right? So we were putting a lot of resources and attention behind making sure that federal agencies were following this guidance. And right now, we don't see this policy being implemented in the same way at the same priority that we gave it. And so the text on paper might actually hold a lot of resemblance to what we did, but in practice, that's not happening on the ground. And so that's where I think there's more of a 180, um, not necessarily in policy, but in practice. And that's where I think it's really easy as a like academic or a policy person to get lost in the wording of what's going on and say, oh, actually, these memos are the same. It's all fine. But really, we have to look at like what is actually happening with the development of these AI systems. Are they becoming more fair or not? And I think the answer, unfortunately, in this administration has been no, they're not.
Yeah. That's such a great point though when we sort of think about the on the ground implementation, right? All we can write all these policies to the nth degree, but if they don't actually get implemented and carried out, then we're kind of where we started from, except we have this document that maybe at some point will be revisited and actually implemented consistent with the vision that you had when you wrote it. Yeah. I was wondering if you might just talk very, very briefly about the kind of backgrounds that the folks that you were working with who wrote this document, just to, I think, give some of our audience a little understanding of sort of the backgrounds that people who are thinking about these issues, where they're coming from, because obviously you talked about your background and I'm sure others share
Mhm.
that, but probably some other different backgrounds as well.
Yeah, it was fascinating because like having a master's in computer science and being a more technical person in government, I thought that I would be one of the more technical people in the room most times, right? Or the most technical person in the room. And I often, very often was not. I was very often the least technical. And that's because the White House in particular is pretty good at recruiting technical talent. The government as a whole is not, right? But the White House has both a number of mechanisms to make it happen and the allure to be able to like get people to come. Um, and I think that that creates a pretty technically informed pocket of expertise in the White House. And so a lot of the people I was working with, Suresh is a good example. Um, are very technical, have deep expertise on the technology. And that was one pocket of people that worked on these issues. Um, then in the White House that I worked in that administration, we had a large number of social scientists and sociologists and folks with sort of a broad range of expertise in academic topics that were that are sort of part of this broader socio-technical way of approaching AI policy, right? People who look at the impacts of technology on society. So that was a large part of the development of a lot of policy was folks like that. And then we had the folks across the White House who worked on their various different topics that intersected with AI, right? So the White House is full of all of these policy councils, like the National Economic Council, the National Security Council, the Domestic Policy Council. These groups tend to have folks like economists and lawyers and lots of lawyers and national security experts and folks who are thinking day in, day out about cybersecurity um, and sanctions, right? Like all of these different topics that you see in the news as policy topics, right? There's someone in the White House thinking about that, and some of those people are intersecting with the AI policy work we're doing. And so you get this really broad range of people who are working on AI policy across the board. The day-to-day people, though, at least when we were there, tended to include this cluster of like quite technical academic folks and like basically more politically oriented doers plus this like socio-technical set of expertise um folks who like we had a couple folks who had a sociology perspective, for example, right? Like that group of people. And you can see their fingerprints on documents like the AI Bill of Rights, right? It is a document that I think does a good job of transcending both the technical and the socio-technical parts of AI policy pretty well.
Yeah. I love that, and that sort of underscores your point before that this is so interdisciplinary, right? Like this bill couldn't have been written the way it was without those different folks coming together and working on it.
Correct.
Yeah, yeah. So moving to the next question, how do you think about the opportunities and limits of technical fixes compared to structural or policy intervention?
Mhm.
How do you mitigate bias and discrimination in AI when the US keeps failing to pass any meaningful or AI or privacy legislation?
Yeah, so a couple different pieces here. Let's start with the first one. This question of sort of technical versus other interventions. I think it's a yes and. The way I think about it is like you see a problem in the world where AI is helping to exacerbate or create some sort of bias, right? And you look at that problem and try to think about all of the different ways you can tackle it. Because if an AI system is creating that bias in the world, sometimes the answer is to try to mitigate the bias in the AI system itself, but sometimes it is to think about that broader system and think about are there other intervention points to help mitigate that bias. It doesn't have to always be just at that AI system level, and that's where I think a lot of our policy discussions get a little bit silly, where people will act like AI is causing the problem, so that means that that's where the solution has to be. And that's not actually how policy works. That's not how governance should work. We should be zooming out and thinking more broadly about the system as a whole and thinking about where all of the potential intervention points could be. You've seen this play out very recently in an adjacent field in the sort of debates over open source AI, right? The idea that these powerful AI models are increasingly um, available to people to use in society, and that introduces some risks. And I think there's a fair debate to be had there. But what a lot of policymakers have jumped to a conclusion of is to say that, oh, we should actually just like suppress the availability of these open models. And when you actually think about what the real risks are, right? Like one of the risks is that people might use these AI models to like help figure out how to make a bioweapon. And like that's bad, right? We don't want that. But a bad person is going to get access to one of these powerful models and do that. Like, limiting the access isn't going to really tackle that problem. What you actually want to do in a situation like that is reduce people's access to the chemicals needed to make those bioweapons, right? That actually helps tackle the problem. And so, even if AI is exacerbating the problem in that case, going after AI in that specific case doesn't actually solve the problem. And so being able to think like that, I think, is really important. And that happens all the time in the case of AI bias as well. That you'll see AI being used in places where it exacerbates um, bias or sort of further perpetuates a system that isn't good. And like the problem often is the system. It's not the use of AI in that case. Not always, but that's how I think about that set of things. And when we go to the question of like this feeling kind of hopeless in this moment where the federal government in the US at least continues to just not pass any comprehensive AI policy in Congress, there are a couple places that give me a lot of optimism actually. One is that you've seen a number of state governments make some real progress on uh, essentially encouraging companies to, and requiring in some cases companies to disclose more information about their AI models, to assess for bias, to essentially move the responsibility of doing that work further up the stream of AI development so you can catch it earlier rather than waiting for the harm to happen in the real world and then using civil rights laws to try to go after that. And so that's been good. The other piece I would point to for some optimism is um, we don't have to solve all of these problems just with new policy. We have old policy that works in many of these cases. Civil rights laws, I mean, basically say in a lot of cases, you can't discriminate in these particular ways. It doesn't matter if you use AI or not. So we have some law that we can use to go after AI bias, and we've seen many successful cases in that vein. And also, we don't have to use policy at all in some of these cases. I mean, we've seen, um, take the SAG-AFTRA protests in California, for example, where it was unions that stood up to particular use of AI or in the UK, where there were a number of students who protested over the use of AI to help decide who would go to college and who wouldn't, right? Like that was sort of a social movement. That's not a policy thing. And so there are all these places where you can actually push for more equitable and fair uses of AI without having to get the government involved. And I think in a world where we can't really expect much progress on AI bias from the federal government, we got to look to state governments and to non-governmental ways of making progress.
Wow, there was so much in that response. Thank you, Nick. I think there's three threads that I kind of want to just pull out of that really struck me as you were speaking. The first is just this idea of, sort of reimagining the problem, right? And I think again, as you mentioned, we have a very interdisciplinary perspective in our program, but also at Brown. And we know that when we look at things from through different disciplinary lenses, we do see things differently and we're able to come up with different kinds of solutions. So I really appreciate that. And I think folks in the audience sort of listening to this need to realize how multidimensional the the issues are, but also how multidimensional the solutions can be, right? And so I think that's really good. And that gets to your second point about like there is optimism for this. Like I think a lot of the media right now is this is bad and it's going to ruin the world. And in reality, there's so much good that we can do with this, and that there are tools at our disposal to think about policy and regulation and fairness. And so I think those are things to hang on to.
Yeah, and I think on that optimism point too, I think it's been really interesting to watch the contours of this debate shift in the last couple of years because when I was in the White House from mid 2021 till the end of 2023, um, for the first half of the time I was there, like mid 21 till the end of 2022, these issues around bias and fairness, right? The use of AI in ways um, that were biased, that was a top tier issue on AI, right? Like when somebody said like what should we do on AI? Going after bias in AI was like one of the first three things you'd hear. It would be something like we should mitigate bias, we should promote research and development, um, and I don't know, like third thing would be something else, whatever, like something national security probably, right? And like the US should lead the world on the development of cutting edge AI. It's probably like that combination of three things you would hear for the first half of the last presidency. Um, and then in the second half, you saw this big debate erupt over safety and
Mm,
security. In particular, there was a large debate over like should we in the public, I'm not saying this was in government, but like in the public there was this big debate over like should we just shut down the development of AI at the cutting edge, or should we just like uh, put no restrictions at all, so we can beat China. And so that became the dominant uh, sort of debate for I would say, the second half of the last administration. And I think today the debate is starting to move from, I think we still have the big sort of national security dimension and competitiveness, the US-China debate, but we're starting to see a much more populist strain of AI policy emerge, where like I'm sure a lot of you on this call, like if you're on social media and you're reading things about AI, I'm sure you've seen things about people complaining about the water and energy use of AI. Like that is a very dominant strain in the argument right now. We can go back and forth about how legitimate those critiques are, but like that is the like I think emerging direction here of like there is this very sort of that's part of this broader populist critique right now of like, hey, are these systems actually serving working people, regular people across this country? Who is getting the share of the profits of this? And I think that that is a perspective where it's not fully clear to someone like me and to many of us, I think, exactly how these debates over bias and fairness will fit in there. I think there's a world where it does, but like it has the sort of political energy around tackling bias and fairness in AI has dropped a little, which actually maybe gives us some opportunity to go quietly do the work that needs to be done rather than making it this sort of top tier political issue where it gets stuck in political gridlock. So anyway, it was a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's like that's where my head is at these days of like that's the interesting politics part of this right now.
Well, and again, that gets back to what you started with your career and where your career is going. So it's interesting to sort of see your thinking about it mirroring your career. But I also think it's interesting because it is really embodying this idea of reframing the issues, right? And so as I'm listening to you, I'm hearing how this, this ground is literally shifting under our feet in terms of how we think about this, and who the players
Yeah.
are. And I find that really fascinating. So, the other thing I just want to point out is that, the importance of just the grassroots movements on this.
Mhm.
And, you spoke a little bit about the unions. And I think sometimes in our society today, we kind of get stuck feeling like there's nothing we can do. And so I was really happy that you pointed out that there are things that the everyday person can be doing. And, you know, I don't know if you want to just, I mean, obviously demonstrating is one thing, but maybe there are other little things that people could be doing as they're having conversations with other people or things they should read or do. Any suggestions for the folks on the call in terms of the sort of the more the grassroots level?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think there's a lot you can do in the grassroots level, and I think it's very dependent too on your sort of orientation on it, right? Like a lot of people, and this isn't necessarily what I would suggest, but like a lot of people would get that question and say like you can just refuse to use AI in a number of contexts, right? There's that sort of personal refusal dimension that, it's I think my critique of that would be like it's kind of similar to how like you changing your own individual behaviors to help reduce the impacts of climate change, right? Like might be nice on the margin, but like we need systemic change, right? So like that's we could have that debate, right? But like that's one set of things you can do, right? You can make active choices in your own life about how you use AI and engage with AI systems. Another set of things you can do is just raise awareness. Um, because despite there having been like roughly a decade of serious public discussion about the risks of AI and the benefits and just sort of the governance challenges, what I have found is that in many business environments, the people who are actively debating whether to use an AI system, whether to procure one, how to deploy one, haven't really thought about the ethical implications. And I don't blame them. I mean, these are business people who are in business environments. Like, this is not their day to day. But you will often find yourself around people who haven't thought about these concerns. and may actually be receptive to thinking about them, just haven't had the opportunity to. And so wherever you see those conversations happening, you have an opportunity to say, hey, have you thought about like how this might introduce bias? And you can impact these individual decisions in a way that like doesn't require policy, doesn't require sort of mobilizing a large group of people. It's just like introducing the concept to someone who might be sympathetic, right? So it's almost like finding your allies who are already out there with some power, and helping shape those decisions. That's another spot I would mention. And then the third place I would point out, and it's a little similar, is that we are in this moment right now where AI is diffusing throughout society. It's like there's still work happening to like push the frontier, make the most powerful systems, etc., right? And there's still work happening to develop more sort of use case specific models, right? But the right now where we're seeing the actual impacts on real people is being increasingly based on where AI systems are being adopted in the real world. And so if you go on and you work in, say, healthcare, right? Like say you after you graduate from Brown as an undergrad or after you get your MD, right? Like and you go into medicine, you are going to be in a field where the primary focus of the field isn't AI, but you can bring some of that perspective in. And so I would think about what you can do in whatever career you end up in, or wherever you end up after this, to bring that perspective in, um, because those are the places where the actual impacts of AI on the real world, and especially around bias and fairness, will be felt, right? Like going from GPT-4 to 5 doesn't really change the like contours of bias problems in the world around AI, right? But like how a hospital chooses to use an AI algorithm to determine which patients get access to care first and which patients get deprioritized, like that's where you're going to actually see the impact of AI adoption on bias in the real world. So like if you're going to go become a doctor, or end up in the healthcare space, like thinking about where you can bring that perspective in actually can have a huge impact.
Yeah, I just love that because, for those folks on the call, it gives you some empowerment to be able to maybe do something if you are getting frustrated or kind of worried about things. So thanks for sharing those really specific suggestions, Nick. I think that's great. Um, I want to have you hit on one more topic, and then maybe we'll flex into some questions. But I'm gonna sort of leave this one up to you and see if you want to pick something else that you want to talk about here that I haven't asked you today, as sort of that last question.
Yeah. Why don't we go with the question you have?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting to sort of think about given where we are, because everything is shifting so quickly. So even though it seems like the Biden White House wasn't that long ago, in terms of AI, it feels like it was a long time ago.
Mhm.
So if you were going to redo that work, either what would be in that AI Bill of Rights today, or would you use a different process to sort of think through how to write that bill?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there are a couple things I would do differently, and I don't think we did it wrong in the moment given what we knew at the time. Um, but there are a couple things I think I would emphasize. One is we didn't put as much of an emphasis on economic issues and labor. And that makes sense because that document was intended to be primarily a civil rights document, right? It was like, how do you use AI in a way that protects um, people's rights, opportunities, access to services, right? It's this sort of very traditional notion of civil rights, then expanded to the digital age. And I think what a perspective we lost that you're now seeing really emerge in this populist moment is this is essentially a racial justice framing around economic opportunity. Um, Thinking about the dimensions, for example, of like, do underserved communities have the same access to these tools and the profits derived from these tools, right? And that should never be a cover for justifying sort of biased use of AI, which often happens. So I'm not trying to equate these, but like that dimension of it wasn't really emphasized in some of the work we were doing. It was emphasized elsewhere in the administration's work, right? But I think being able to bring that into a little bit more of a cohesive vision around the future of AI that we're trying to envision, that I think would have been good. Um, the other place that I think I'll give two other spots I would have done a little bit differently. Another piece there was like we were really focused on predictive AI, um, and I don't think that's wrong for a document primarily focused on civil rights, because I think that most of the civil rights concerns around AI are generally around predictive AI and not generative AI. But I do think, given how much emphasis there's been on generative AI in this moment, figuring out how to bring that racial justice vision to generative AI, I think would have been good. And then the last piece I would emphasize is around the tools we use to advance the work. I think that is very easy for our next administration to just undo the creation of policy. And even though I mentioned a lot of the key things stayed on, again, a lot of the things didn't. And what they can't undo is if you get money out the door before the end of an administration. And we saw that across the board with a lot of different Biden administration priorities, right? Where a lot of the priorities were around getting money out the door to infrastructure projects, for example. But we didn't quite do that to the same extent on AI. We had a couple, multi-hundred-million-dollar projects here and there for different AI related things, and we had the sort of continual R&D funding that happens through NSF, the NIH, etc. on AI, but we didn't have the sort of like more massive effort you might have had to create public infrastructure around AI at a larger scale, for example. And I think if I could go back in time 4 years and reset the agenda, I would have made that a higher priority because you can't easily undo that. And it also can have a huge impact on making the ecosystem more fair, right? This isn't just about R&D um, and sort of public counterparts in the abstract. It can also be a mechanism for creating a new way of developing AI systems with the right incentives that are more fair and more equitable. So that's another, this sort of like public AI dimension of things that I think you hear a lot more conversation about these days because it's a little bit more in that economic populism strain of debate. We didn't have that as much 4 years ago, but I wish we did because I think it would have sustained a little bit better.
Hmm. Yeah, that's I was just sort of thinking also, because my discipline is higher ed. Would Do you think you all might have thought about just how we in the education sphere are talking about AI and policy and ethics?
Yeah.
Maybe that would have been a priority in our school
I
systems and philosophy.
I think there's like a zoomed out version of that that needs to be a part of the policy conversation going forward. I think education certainly does need to be a part of it to begin with, and it was. I don't want to say it wasn't. It just was in different pockets of the work.
Yeah.
Um, But I think there's a broader sort of debate happening right now, and I think it's a good debate about how AI is transforming um, how we think
Mhm.
and the role of education and the role of sort of labor. And that feels like a really important debate, right? There's like all of this discussion about like, is it dumbing us down as people? Is it like taking away our ability to think critically about the world? And that has huge implications for society. And I don't know what the right policy solutions for that are. But I think we need to be having that conversation. And I think it was really hard to tell in 2021 that that's where we were headed, right? Because think like back in 2021, chatbots were like not a thing,
Yeah.
right? Like they existed and they sucked. Like I worked on maybe the first chatbot policy for the administration, which was like an internal facing document of like, hey, here are the rules around like, attempting to say government wide, like here are the rules around where you can or can't use chatbots. And I thought it was like one of the stupidest projects I got assigned because I was sitting there being like, who cares? No one uses this stuff. It doesn't work, right? Like it's all formulaic. You ask some question, you get like some like, sorry, I didn't understand because your prompt wasn't in the five answers I'm trained to respond to. Answer back. And so that was like that's what was happening in 2021. And
Yeah.
so I think it was really hard in that moment to be like, oh, this might just like fully change the role of thinking in the world. Like that's not where people were at. But I think in this moment and going forward, I think education and more broadly, like thinking is a real dimension of AI we need to be grappling with. I think it's one of the most legitimate, like, hey, maybe we should slow down and like reflect on this sort of dimensions of AI policy right now.
Yeah, and we certainly are having those conversations, but I think for for those of us in academia, we are struggling with it, in large part because it's just uncharted territory for us. And I would also say we probably should be listening more closely to folks like you who are in this space and already thinking, about broader policy, and we should be learning from you and thinking about our, higher education in particular is a segment that I know. But yeah, that I think that's something that we can continue to learn from what you all have done. So Nick, this has been amazing. I know we have a couple of questions in the Q&A. Amanda volunteered to read those for us, so we'll put you on the hot seat here for a couple of minutes.
Okay,
Amanda?
so we do have one question. If anyone else has questions, feel free to throw them in the Q&A or the chat and we'll get to them. But first off, this is a little long, so I'm gonna speak slowly so you can absorb everything. But it seems organizations struggle to adopt AI systems not because they can't explain model behavior technically, but because they lack confidence and accountability structures when things go wrong. Other fields have solved for this, e.g., doctors use diagnostic tools they don't fully understand, but there are clear liability frameworks and professional standards. How do you see AI governance evolving beyond better interpretability towards frameworks that enable organizational trust, even with inherently opaque systems?
It's a good question. Um, I think that we often over-index on interpretability as the thing that matters. I certainly think it matters. Not trying to say it doesn't. Um, but I think it's more about shifting from interpretability and liability as the sort of primary instruments of making this stuff work toward things like professional standards and audits and redress when things go wrong. And so essentially, this kind of gets back to the point I was making earlier of like, we sometimes over-index on the use of AI and the intervention there as the thing that matters rather than looking at the system more broadly. Like I think about, for example, how software engineers in many companies are allowed to use AI and Copilot in the way they want, except that the software engineer is responsible for the code that they push forward. And so they can use whatever tools they want, but the accountability lies with the human that is hired to do the job still. And I think that that's the um, sort of approach we're going to need where interpretability is hard and liability is messy to try to shift things toward some framework of accountability and responsibility, but sort of looking at the sort of bigger picture, the decision chain essentially, um, and basing things off of that. So that's where I would point there. The other bit I would add is um, on the question of organizational trust toward the end there, I think this gets to a really important bit around AI adoption, which is rules on paper are just one thing. The actual way they are implemented in organizations and the trust that people have in that process is another thing, right? Rules on paper help us build trust, but really we need these feedback loops, where you see things working regularly and you see what happens when something goes wrong, that there's a process in place and that there's leadership that cares about getting this right. And we've solved this to some extent, to a decent extent actually, around privacy, right? So the United States famously doesn't have a national privacy law, um, but a lot of companies have created chief privacy officers and have prioritized it a little bit more than you would expect, um, for companies that don't have a legal obligation nationally to do this. Um, and the result has been that when you look at some of the research on how privacy is implemented in practice among American companies versus European companies, often the actual outcomes are better in American companies,
Mm.
despite the fact that the EU has GDPR and much stronger laws. So I wouldn't over-index either on liability or sort of specific legal frameworks around this, because I do think that the processes around creating trust, which is such a human artifact, right? It's like a thing that goes beyond just like the words on paper. Um, that's such a human thing that we can create that trust in ways that don't necessarily involve specific legal instruments to help us get there.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions before we hop into our program presentation?
Nik, can you just give us the 30-second sneak peek of the two courses, where you're going with
Yeah.
those? I think the audience, even if they're not in the program, might be really interested to see how you've sort of put all this experience and your thoughts together into a course, two courses.
Yeah, so I've got two courses. One is on bias and fairness in AI. And so that course is trying to cover essentially the whole um, set of things around identifying, measuring, and mitigating bias, and promoting fairness in AI. So it looks at it from a number of different dimensions, from a technical perspective, um, looking at, for example, what different parts of the AI stack can do to help introduce bias into an AI system and what we can do at those levels of the stack to help mitigate it. Um, it looks at the socio-technical perspective of how civil society, for example, can be involved in helping increase public participation, and oversight and accountability into how AI systems are used. And it also looks at the legal and policy dimensions, looking at the various successes and failures of policy to help mitigate AI bias, what the existing laws we have around civil rights in the US and around human rights around the world can and can't do in this moment to help mitigate bias, and what the emerging frontier of that work looks like. So that's course one. And course two is a course on advanced topics in AI governance, um, which it's still in development, so this is all with an asterisk that some of this might change. But the idea there is essentially to do a number of deeper dives into the current frontier of AI policy. So, for example, looking at the debates over open source AI and what has shaped that and some of the recent fights that have played out over that. Or, for example, looking at the intersection of AI and labor, how policymakers and unions and companies have thought about how AI may or may not displace workers and what some of the interventions around them might look like, and how policy has increasingly been trying to grapple with this in recent years. And so it's essentially going to be seven sections of these specific topics that are kind of, really gaining a lot of momentum right now in AI policy, and then a case study paired with each. Most of those are going to be like policy fights that I was a part of in some way. So I'm hoping to try to shed some light on the inner workings of how some of these things happen. Um, and highlight just like how malleable this stuff is, how like you can be a part of shaping what happens here. Like the end of all of this, if I can leave you with one thing, it's like 100 to 200 people who like actually make the real decisions on these things. And like you can just go be one of those people. So like go do that. It's cool, it's impactful. This may be like some of the most important stuff you could be working on. I certainly think it is, and so I would love to see more people bring this interdisciplinary expertise into the world and try to help us make AI better for everyone.
Well, we are so lucky, not only to have you in our program, but to have you, give us your time today. These remarks have been eye-opening. I know every time I talk to Nik, my brain is always spinning in new directions. So thank you so much, Nik, for your comments today.
Yeah, well, happy to join you guys, and thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I think I'll
Thank
turn
you.
things over to Amanda now, who will, for those of you who are interested in the program, we know some of you were attending to listen to Nik talk, so please feel free to hop off. But for those of you who would like to hear more about our program, I will turn it over to Amanda.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you so much for moderating that discussion. It was great. And like Linda said, if you aren't interested in applying to the program, that's fine. Feel free to sign off. We are just going to go over a little high-level information about the program and the application process. So the program is completely online. It is 100% asynchronous, which means there aren't any times that you have to log on to the online course platform, but there are weekly synchronous sessions that are optional. So these are held during the evening and allow students to get a chance to discuss what they've been learning with the faculty and then their peers. And these aren't required, but they are recorded. So if you aren't able to come, you're able to watch the recording. And we do get some questions about does asynchronous mean self-paced? And the answer is no. So the program is designed over 14-week semesters, and there are modules each week. So each class has 14 modules, and there are going to be assignments and due dates each week of the semester. So you can do the work whenever you want, but you will have deadlines each semester. The program is 8 total courses, and full-time students take 2 courses a semester for 4 consecutive semesters. So if you started in the spring, you'd go spring, summer, fall, spring, for a total of 16 months. And we do offer the ability to go part-time. So if you only want to take 1 class a semester for the entirety or part of the program, you can work with your academic advisor once you're admitted to set up a custom plan of study. In terms of tuition, the program is $7,500 a course, and we do offer merit-based scholarships up to 50% of the tuition. When you apply for the program, you are automatically considered for one of these merit scholarships, and you will receive the decision for that along with your admissions decision. And then taking a look at the standard course sequence, Linda, do you want to say anything about the courses?
Sure.
High level.
We've been fortunate to hear a lot about the 2 of the courses in semester 3 and 4 that Nik is teaching, so you can see how those fit in the broader plan. What we've done is Nik alluded to. This is a very interdisciplinary program. If you are attending full time, you will be taking 2 courses a semester. And we have paired a predominantly technical course with a predominantly policy governance course, although they do talk to each other. So they are not just a straight up technical course nor a straight up policy course. So in your first semester, you're basically getting up to speed on your foundational skills and thinking about those foundational skills relative to some of the issues that Nik talked about today. So it's not just the technical skills. And then your basic introduction to AI and policy. The second semester is where you really start to jump in heavy duty to the content. And we like to think of this as the inputs into policy. And so thinking about policy that is driven by data. So our evidence-driven policy course, and that is accompanied by a data engineering course where, again, it's not just about data engineering, but it's about these decisions, as Nik alluded to, that we're making as we're doing the data engineering. And then that third semester is Nik's course, accompanied by an MLDL course. So Nik's course is really about how these fairness and bias issues are impacting these models, and that course teaches you more about the models. And then the last semester is going to be a really amazing experience. So you've got that advanced topics course with Nik, and that's accompanied by an applied learning course where you'll have an opportunity to actually integrate the concepts from the curriculum into an applied learning experience, and that can take a number of different formats. Again, we haven't had a cohort go through those, but we are designing that course with some flexibility there because we know many of our students will be working professionals.
Thank you. And now taking a look at some online student highlights. Like I mentioned before, courses are accessible from anywhere through Canvas, our learning management system. Um, a question we get a lot is about, what is this degree going to say? So you are awarded a Master of Science in Data Science, and the transcript and the degree will not indicate that you studied online. Um, Additionally, you are invited to our commencement on campus in May. We like to say Brown online students are just as much a Brown student as our residential students. So we would love for everyone to come if they can, but we also offer virtual ceremonies for folks who aren't able to make the trip to Providence. And again, online students have access to all of Brown's resources, including our library, and the librarians also offer one-on-one virtual appointments if you need help with any of the resources they offer. Our Student Career Services teams offers virtual appointments for resume help, cover letter writing, mock interviews, things like that. And then they also offer virtual networking events or workshops and different panels and things. And also, online students have access to our Student Accessibility Services department. So if you need any sort of accommodations, you're able to get those. Once admitted, students get access to our Foundations and Resource Center, which is kind of an asynchronous orientation, but then also a list of resources that you can utilize through your time at Brown, and then also important contact information for important people that you might need to reach out to. Which brings me to your dedicated support team. We have graduate recruitment counselors who work with students who are applying and help answer any questions about the application process. And then all students are assigned an advising coordinator when they start, who will help with, registration, but then also answering questions that you might have throughout the program about, I need a little bit more academic support in this area, or maybe you need to go on a leave of absence. So you'll always have someone there who can direct you to the appropriate person on campus if they're unable to help. And we're coming up close to the hour, so I just want to put this up here quickly. You can find more information on our website about what you need to apply, but it is an online application. You'll need your resume, um, the contact information for 3 recommenders. We would prefer that at least one of them is a current or former manager, but the remainder can be a mix of different professional or academic sources. We will need your unofficial transcripts for your application. And if you attended a university outside of the US, you will need to submit an international transcript evaluation from WES, Spantran, or ECE for your application to be evaluated. And then there is a $100 application fee, but because you attended this webinar, we will actually be waiving that for you.
So Amanda, we have one comment in the chat before
Oh, yes.
maybe we can read the deadlines. But talking about the faculty, we have been unbelievably fortunate in being able to recruit folks like Nik, and you can read about our other faculty online who have a wealth of applied experience. And they are some of them are full-time, some of them are part-time, but they are considered to be Data Science Institute faculty. They attend our faculty meetings, they serve on search committees. So in addition to maybe doing 10 other things in their other professional lives, they are fully integrated into what we do in the Data Science Institute. We also have a course development process that is very cohesive. So faculty do not sort of go off on their own and develop the courses. These courses are highly coordinated to make sure that they align with the program philosophy, make sure that the courses align with the other courses. And that has been a very rigorous course development process that is not typical in academia. Um, but bringing in maybe some faculty who haven't had these kind of real world experiences, we don't think would have delivered the kind of cutting edge content that is in our courses. So um, it's not going to feel like somebody is popping in to teach this course. These folks are integrated. They are Data Science Institute Brown faculty.
Thanks. And we have some questions in the Q&A that I'm going to jump to. I did just put up on the screen our email address. So onlinemasters_admissions@brown.edu if you want to schedule some time to talk to a graduate recruitment counselor, or you have personal questions that you want to talk through, please send us an email. Our first question, are all courses taught each semester? Not necessarily just because we don't have students starting in summer right now, but for students who are taking a semester off or a leave of absence, we are able to rearrange the courses in a way that still makes sense, where you aren't able, or you won't have to take another semester or break because of course availability. And then we have a question about, are there any instances within the program where students will need to travel to campus? Will we have access to on-campus facilities? So there's never a time that you have to come here. If you never come to Providence in the 16 months, that's totally fine. But if you do, you will have access to all campus facilities. You can get an ID card. You can request building access. You can go to the gym, the library, whatever you want. You are a Brown student.
And we would encourage you to listen to our student panel that we had a few months ago. Again, we only have our first cohort, but some of those students are already taking advantage of some of the on the ground. Some of them are coming here in person. Some of them are participating remotely. So those opportunities are there, again, if you're interested, but you certainly don't have to.
Yes. And then we have two questions about employment. So one is about a percentage of students that are able to obtain employment upon graduation in the current economic environment. And I wish I had a better answer for you, but we actually have our first cohort of students just started in the fall, so we don't have any graduates from this program. But Miriam asked, will you have any help with employment? And the answer is yes. Like I said, we have our Master's Student Career Center, which is a career center that is dedicated to career development for master's students specifically. And so while we can't guarantee employment, we do have resources, including a Brown job board for Brown students. There are then, like I said, the resume writing workshops, people that can help you with your application materials, but then also help talk you through, like, if you need to like dial down on what industry do I want to go into, or what type of role am I really going to look for after this program, they're able to help you do that as well. So we want students to be able to find a job after they they complete this program. That is the goal. That's why we have worked with so many industry people to make sure that the curriculum is relevant to what employers want and are looking for and need. Um, so we will be there to support you and help you get that job that you want after graduation. And I don't see any more questions. I just want to give everyone a chance if you have anything else. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. It was great to hear from Nik, and we hope to see your application come through soon, or you start classes with us in January. So thank you all.
Thank you.